Whilw fixing the flickering lights, the electrician turned pale and whispered, "Get out now. Don't tell your children." I frozen, then saw what was hidden behind the walls. I grabbed my bag and ran. Emily Carter stared at the long stretch of road that led to the small town of Mayfield, a place so quiet it barely showed up on modern maps. Behind her, crammed in the back seat of the rented van, were her two children, Liam, a curious and cautious 9-year-old, and Sophie, 7, already humming a song she'd made up that morning. They were tired, having driven most of the day, but the excitement of a new home sparked something in all three of them. The house was everything Emily had hoped for, at least on paper. A 2-story Victorian-style home nestled between tall pine trees, with a wraparound porch, creaky wooden floors, and a yard big enough for the kids to play. The listing had described it as full of character and a charming piece of local history. What it really meant was that the place was old. Some of the fixtures hadn't been updated in decades, and Emily had made a mental note to get an electrician in soon. But still, this was a fresh start. A real one. As they stepped inside, Liam hesitated just past the threshold. "The lights blinked," he said, looking down the hallway. Emily glanced up at the hanging lamp in the foyer. It flickered faintly, then stabilized. "Just an old bulb," she said with a smile. "We'll change it tomorrow." The children ran off to explore. Sophie claimed the room with the view of the pine grove, while Liam chose the one at the end of the hallway, near the back of the house. That hallway was narrow and a bit darker than the rest, the windows smaller and the floorboards louder. The moment Emily walked down to check on him, she noticed it, the lights there did flicker more than the others. A soft pulse. On. Off. On again. She made another mental note, "Get that checked soon." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows crept in through the tall windows, Emily lit a few candles in the living room. They'd ordered takeout from the only open diner in town and were eating on the floor, surrounded by unopened boxes. Despite the long day, there was a lightness in the room. For the first time in a while, it felt like they were building something new. After dinner, while brushing his teeth, Liam paused at the bathroom door, his toothbrush still in hand. "The lights in that hallway blink harder," he said, nodding toward the back corridor. Emily knelt beside him. "Harder?" He nodded. "Yeah. Almost like they're trying to say something." She smiled, ruffling his hair. "Maybe they're just old and tired." He didn't laugh. Later, after the kids were asleep, Emily stood alone in that hallway. The bulbs overhead gave off a dull, warm glow, and yes, there it was again. A sharp flicker. Then stillness. Then another pulse. Not rhythmic, not consistent. Just strange. She touched the nearest wall, wondering about the wiring. It felt slightly colder than the rest of the house. She told herself it was just the evening air. That's all. Old houses behaved like that. Still, as she turned off the hallway light and made her way to her own room, she couldn't help but glance back once. The hallway had gone completely dark, but for a split second, as she reached her door, one light blinked on. And off again. She didn't say anything to the kids the next morning. There was no reason to. Probably just the system settling. Maybe a loose wire. Nothing more. But when she served them cereal and asked about their plans for the day, Liam responded with a question of his own. "Why does that hallway feel weird?" Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the narrow passage at the back of the house, where the light fixture swayed gently, though there was no breeze. She sipped her coffee. "I'll call someone," she said softly. And she did. The next morning, she dialed the number of a local electrician listed on the community board at the diner. His name was Frank. He said he'd stop by in 2 days. That night, Liam placed a flashlight beside his pillow before falling asleep. Emily noticed, but didn't ask. Somehow, she already knew he wasn't imagining things. The lights didn't just flicker randomly. Not in that hallway. They blinked harder. Sharper. like something behind the walls was shifting, or watching. She shook the thought away. No, she wouldn't let her imagination take over. Not now. This move was supposed to be a fresh start. A calm life. A better place for her children. And yet, the hallway remained, always just a little darker than the rest of the house. The doorbell rang 2 mornings later, just as Emily finished clearing the breakfast dishes. She opened the front door to find a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s standing on the porch. He wore a faded flannel shirt, jeans coated with dust, and work boots that looked older than most of the tools in her garage. His graying beard framed a weathered face, and his eyes had the kind of cautious depth that came from years of seeing more than he was willing to admit. "Frank Delaney," he said, tipping his cap. "You called about flickering lights?" "Yes, thank you for coming," Emily replied, stepping aside. "It's mostly in one of the hallways. Toward the back of the house." Frank nodded and stepped inside, glancing around with the kind of silent calculation that made Emily wonder if he noticed more than he let on. He said little as she led him down the corridor. The moment they reached it, he stopped walking. Emily didn't speak right away. She watched as Frank's gaze fixed on the light fixture above them, which gave off a soft flicker, even now in the morning light. Then, without moving his head, he glanced along the wall. His jaw tightened ever so slightly. "This the place?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes. It happens mostly here. The lights flicker stronger than anywhere else in the house." Frank walked slowly along the hallway, fingers brushing the baseboards, his eyes scanning the edges where the wall met the floor. Emily stayed silent, standing at the other end as he moved. When he reached the middle of the corridor, right beneath the fixture that blinked again with a pulse of light, he stopped abruptly. He placed his hand flat against the wall and remained still for a long moment. Emily stepped forward. "Something wrong?" Frank didn't respond immediately. He tilted his head, listening. Then, under his breath, he muttered something Emily barely caught. "Best stay away from this wall for now." It was quiet. Almost nothing. But it hit her in a way she couldn't explain. There was something in his voice, not fear exactly, but caution. A knowing kind of hesitation. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, stepping closer. Frank turned to her, the lines in his forehead deepening. "Sometimes, older houses like this, they got walls that settle strange. Especially ones with additions or half-finished repairs. Could be a gap behind here. Might explain the odd flickering." "That doesn't really explain what you just said." He avoided her eyes. "I'll check the wiring," he replied instead, reaching into his tool belt. Emily didn't push further. But as she watched him unscrew the light fixture and test the voltage, she noticed his hands moved faster than before. Not rushed, but deliberate, like someone trying to finish a task before something else interfered. The next hour passed with quiet work. Frank tested multiple outlets, opened a panel near the kitchen, and checked the breaker box in the basement. Every so often, Emily caught him glancing toward the back hallway. Once, he even walked past it without going in, only to circle back a minute later and stand at the entrance, staring down its length without moving. When he finally packed up his tools, Emily met him at the door. "Well?" she asked. "Anything dangerous?" Frank shrugged, rubbing the back of his neck. "Wiring's not perfect, but nothing critical. That hallway, though, it's strange. Not just the flickering. The whole section's odd. The current flows slightly uneven there, like it's pulling power from somewhere that doesn't make sense. Like a short? Maybe. Or a panel hidden behind the wall. Could be from a remodel no one documented. Seen it before. But you've also seen something else," Emily pressed gently. "Something you're not saying." Frank hesitated. Then, in a quieter voice, he replied, "Some folks seal things off in old houses. Rooms. Storage areas. Even old wiring channels. Sometimes it's just to avoid repair costs. Sometimes it's to forget." Emily's chest tightened. Forget what? He didn't answer. He stepped outside, tightening his grip on his toolbox. I can come back next week if the lights get worse, he said. But I'd stay out of that hallway for now. Just until you're sure what's behind that wall. Before she could ask anything more, Frank walked briskly down the porch steps and got into his truck. The engine roared to life, and within seconds, he was gone. That evening, after putting the children to bed, Emily sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, but she hadn't typed a word in over an hour. She couldn't stop thinking about what Frank had said, or refused to say. Something about the way he had studied the wall. The way he had touched it, stood before it, then walked away like it didn't belong. Like it had unsettled him. She rose, walked to the back hallway, and stood in the middle of it. The light flickered. Once. Twice. Then dimmed completely for several seconds before coming back to life. She turned and faced the wall directly. There was nothing unusual at first glance. Just old plaster, a few scuff marks, and the faint scent of aged wood and paint. But as she stepped closer and ran her hand along the baseboard, she felt it, a subtle change in texture. A smoother segment of the wall, like it had been patched more recently than the rest. Her fingers trailed lower, toward the bottom edge of the baseboard. And there, barely visible in the low light, was a small line of uneven paint, like someone had painted over a seam. A cover-up. She knelt down and tapped gently. The sound was slightly hollow. A small compartment? A sealed cabinet? An old vent? She didn't know, but she did know one thing: Frank had seen this. He had chosen not to say more. And now it was up to her to decide whether to leave it alone, as he suggested, or dig deeper. Emily sat back on her heels and looked down the hallway. The fixture above flickered again. A breath escaped her lips. Not tonight. But soon. The next morning brought a soft drizzle, painting the windows with fine trails of rain that made the old house feel even quieter than usual. Emily had barely slept. Her dreams had been hazy but intense, something about the hallway, voices she couldn't make out, and flashes of light through cracks in the walls. She woke up before dawn, her thoughts immediately drawn to the corridor. After making sure Liam and Sophie were settled with their cereal and cartoons, she returned to the hallway, this time equipped with a flashlight, a small screwdriver, and an old flathead she had found in the basement. The strange section of the wall was still there, unremarkable on the surface. But now that she knew what to look for, she could see the inconsistencies more clearly: the slightly glossier finish of paint in a narrow band near the floor, the almost imperceptible misalignment in the molding. Emily knelt again, this time not just to examine, but to act. She pressed lightly along the baseboard, her fingers moving with slow precision, until she found a point where the wood gave just a little more than it should. Using the flathead screwdriver, she began to chip away at the seam between two pieces of trim. It was careful, delicate work. She didn't want to break anything, at least not yet. After several minutes of steady prying, a small segment of the baseboard popped loose with a dry creak. Behind it was nothing. Just a sliver of darkness. Holding her breath, she shined the flashlight into the gap. It wasn't deep, maybe only a few inches behind the baseboard, but the surface beyond it was different. It wasn't just drywall or insulation. It looked like wood. A vertical board, aged and faintly stained, as though it had been exposed to something long ago. Emily reached into the opening and tapped the wooden surface beyond. The sound was muted, yet resonant. Not hollow, but not solid either. Like something layered, sealed with intention. She tried pressing harder against the interior wall, but it didn't budge. Then she saw it, faint scratch marks in the dust. Tiny, shallow lines that ran in different directions, barely noticeable unless you were looking for them. Someone had opened this before. Or tried to. Emily pulled back and sat on the floor, the screwdriver still in her hand. Her heart beat faster than she wanted to admit. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was a rising tension, a sense that she was getting close to something deliberately hidden, something that had gone untouched for a long time. Later that afternoon, Once the kids were busy in the backyard under light supervision from a neighbor, Emily returned with a small utility knife and a pry bar she had borrowed. She widened the opening, lifting another length of baseboard and then carefully cutting away the thin layer of wall covering above the narrow space. As she worked, dust filled the air, and with it, the scent of old wood and something else, something dry and faintly metallic. Finally, she peeled back enough of the outer layer to reveal what looked like a narrow compartment, only a few inches deep, stretching along the bottom of the wall. Inside, she could see remnants of something that had once been there, dark smudges, a bit of crumbled paper, and several tiny, rectangular impressions in the dust, like the outlines of small boxes or objects that had been removed. At the very end of the compartment, partially hidden beneath dust and debris, was a folded piece of paper. She pulled it out carefully and unfolded it. The paper was old and yellowed, the ink faded to the point of near illegibility. Still, a few lines were visible. "Keep out of sight, this is not for them. Only open if truly necessary. Remember the name, Harrison." Emily stared at the words, her fingers tingling with the mix of adrenaline and confusion. The handwriting was uneven, rushed. There was no date. No signature. Just those fragmented instructions and a name she didn't recognize. She placed the note on the nearby table and returned her attention to the wall. Whatever had been stored here was gone. But it had clearly mattered, enough to be hidden, sealed, and even warned against. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about the compartment. During dinner, Liam asked if the lights were going to keep blinking, and Emily told him the electrician had fixed most of the issues. She didn't mention the note. She didn't say anything about what she'd found. Not yet. Once the kids were in bed, Emily sat in the hallway again, staring at the exposed space beneath the wall. The note was now folded and tucked into a book in her bedroom drawer, but the message lingered. The name Harrison meant nothing to her, no family connection, no reference in the paperwork for the house. It was just a name. A leftover from another era. And yet, the moment she'd read it, something had settled uncomfortably in her chest. A weight, like a memory she didn't own trying to press its way to the surface. She ran her hand along the edge of the opening again and noticed something she'd missed earlier, a thin line of scarring along the inner wood, near where the paper had been. It looked like heat damage, faint and irregular. The kind that came from something burning nearby. Not a fire. Something smaller. A candle? A match? Emily stood and stepped back, studying the wall as a whole. What else was hidden here? What had been stored, and more importantly, why had it been removed? Her mind began to build possibilities, documents, perhaps. Journals. Maybe old family records or personal belongings. But something about the warning, "not for them," made her think this wasn't just about sentiment. It felt like protection. Or secrecy. She didn't sleep much that night. Every sound in the house echoed longer than usual. At one point, shortly after midnight, she thought she heard something, a light tap, like a knock against wood. She sat up in bed, straining to hear more, but the house returned to silence. When morning came, she made a decision. She would go to the town records office. She would look up the house. The name Harrison. The ownership history. Everything. Because someone had left a warning in that wall, and even if it had been forgotten by time, it hadn't been erased. And now, she had found it. The Mayfield Town Hall sat at the far end of Main Street, a two-story brick building with tall arched windows and a faint scent of old paper that seeped out the moment Emily stepped through the front doors. The woman at the front desk, wearing a cardigan with coffee stains on the sleeve, barely glanced up as Emily approached. "I'm looking for property records," Emily said, clutching her tote bag. "Specifically for a house on Pine Crescent. Number 46. The woman pointed to a door down the hall without a word. Inside the records room, everything smelled of dust and ink. Wooden cabinets lined the walls, and a man in his 60s stood behind a counter flipping through a large binder. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and had a voice like sandpaper when Emily explained what she was looking for. 46 Pine Crescent, he muttered, tapping a few keys on an ancient terminal. That house's changed hands a few times. Not unusual for that end of town. Older builds. High maintenance. I'm looking for anything from the 1950s, she said. He raised an eyebrow. Going that far back? Gonna need the basement files. Might take some digging. I have time. He didn't respond. He disappeared through a door behind him, and 10 minutes later returned with 3 worn boxes marked, Property Archives, 1950s, Residential. Emily sat at a nearby table and began sorting through manila folders, her heart picking up speed as she flipped page after page. The first folder contained tax assessments. The next, copies of sales contracts. And then, finally, in the third box, she found a thin file marked, Harrison, Lot 46P. The paper was brittle and yellowed. It listed a transfer of ownership dated May of 1951. Leonard Harrison and his wife, Margaret, had purchased the home shortly after its initial construction. He had listed his profession as a woodworker, and she, a part-time gardener. There was nothing remarkable in the details, no notations, no official complaints, no addendums. But then, at the bottom of the final page, someone had scribbled a note in pencil. Modifications not listed. Handled privately. Emily stared at those words, tracing them with her finger. It was vague, almost deliberately so. But it confirmed what she had suspected: changes had been made to the structure without documentation. And likely without permission. Behind the file was a folded sheet tucked between 2 envelopes. She unfolded it carefully and found a rough hand-drawn layout of the house. It was familiar: living room, kitchen, 3 bedrooms, the central hallway. But something didn't match. There was a thin rectangle along the rear corridor, an unmarked section, about 2 feet wide, stretching the length of one wall. It had no label. No door. A hidden space. Emily took a photo of the drawing with her phone and returned the papers to the file. Back home, she spread out everything on the kitchen table: the photos from the records office, the note she'd found in the compartment, and the rough layout. The unmarked space on the drawing matched almost exactly with the section of the wall where the flickering light had always been strongest. She pulled out a measuring tape and walked to the hallway. Carefully, she measured the dimensions from the blueprint and compared them to the physical space. The numbers didn't add up. From the outside, the hallway wall should have ended several inches sooner. The space on the blueprint hinted at a shallow cavity, one that hadn't been opened in decades, possibly not since it had been sealed. Later that evening, after putting Liam and Sophie to bed, Emily returned to the hallway with a headlamp, gloves, and a small hammer. The children had been unusually quiet that day, though Sophie had asked if they were going to get another visitor. Emily had pretended not to understand the question, brushing it off as imagination. She knelt by the section of wall again and tapped lightly. The tone shifted. A different echo, subtle, but present. She ran her hand along the plaster until she felt a slight rise, almost like a seam beneath the paint. Taking a deep breath, she began chipping away at the surface, working slowly and carefully. Behind the outer layer was an older plaster, yellowed and brittle. As she peeled it away, a narrow wooden panel emerged, faded and scratched. It had no handle. No hinges. Just a rectangular frame set into the wall. She pressed against it. It didn't move. Emily stepped back, assessing. Then, using the claw end of the hammer, she carefully wedged it into a small gap between the panel and the frame. With a sharp tug, the edge creaked. And then, with a slow groan, the panel shifted. Dust poured out first. Then stale, unmoving air. The smell was earthy and thick, not mold, but something older, like the inside of an antique trunk. Behind the panel was a recess. Not deep, perhaps a foot or so, but long, stretching the length of the sealed section. Inside were shelves. Simple wooden boards attached directly to the inner frame. On them sat a few objects: a tin box, a cracked glass jar, and several sheets of rolled parchment bound with a leather strap. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she reached in and pulled out the tin box. It was lighter than expected. Inside were buttons, old coins, and a folded photograph. The image was grainy, a man and a woman standing in front of the house, smiling stiffly. The woman held a small object in her hands, though it was too blurred to make out. On the back, written in neat cursive, were the words, "Keep safe. Not for others." Emily set it aside and reached for the jar. It was empty, except for a strip of cloth at the bottom, faded blue, with tiny embroidered stars. A child's toy? A handkerchief? And then, finally, the parchment. She unrolled it carefully. It was a diagram. Not of the house. Not exactly. It appeared to be a layout of the rear portion of the home, but with annotations, arrows, labels, and symbols she didn't recognize. Some of the notations were in English. Others weren't. One line stood out, written clearly near the top, "Built to shield, not to expose." That night, Emily sat on the edge of her bed, the parchment spread out before her. The hidden compartment had been partially discovered, but the more she uncovered, the less she understood. She hadn't found anything dangerous. No evidence of crime or tragedy. Just warnings. Repetition. Instructions to stay away, to protect, to not reveal. But protect what? And from whom? Whatever the Harrisons had sealed behind that wall had been important enough to hide. Important enough to design into the structure itself. And now, 70 years later, someone else had found it. Her. The flickering lights in the hallway had finally stopped. But something told her the real current, the current that mattered, had only just started to flow. Emily woke the next morning to a soft thud echoing from downstairs. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough to jolt her upright. She paused, waiting for a second sound, but the house returned to silence. After dressing quickly and checking on the kids, both still asleep, she moved cautiously down the staircase. Nothing appeared out of place in the kitchen or the living room, but when she reached the hallway, her steps slowed. The narrow corridor was quiet now, still dim even in daylight. The hidden compartment remained exposed, the panel slightly ajar where she had left it the night before. She knelt to inspect it again, but everything inside was exactly as she'd left it, no signs of disturbance. But when she stood and turned to leave, something odd caught her attention. There, just beside the baseboard on the opposite wall, was a new trail of dust, thin, barely noticeable, like something had shifted recently. She hadn't noticed it yesterday. She stepped closer and ran her finger along the floor. A faint drag mark curved along the wood, small but deliberate. It didn't look like a random pattern from age or settling. It looked like something had been moved. She searched the area but found no loose boards or compartments. Still, her unease grew. Later that day, while Liam and Sophie were outside drawing with chalk on the driveway, Emily returned to her notes and the documents from town hall. Something about the Harrison family didn't sit right with her. There was too much missing, no records of departure, no transfer of belongings, no indication of why they'd left the house after only a few years. She opened her laptop and searched deeper, using online archives, newspaper databases, and old obituaries. After nearly 2 hours of sifting through irrelevant records, she found a brief article dated June 3, 1955. Local man Leonard Harrison leaves town quietly. The article was short and vague. It mentioned Leonard's decision to pursue opportunities elsewhere, and that he had left Mayfield without a formal goodbye. The piece was unsigned and had no quotes, no follow-up, no mention of Margaret or anyone else. No moving truck was referenced. No interviews with neighbors. Just a quiet disappearance, wrapped in polite language. That same day, Emily drove to the Mayfield Historical Society, a small stone building tucked between a bank and a pharmacy. She spoke with a volunteer named Thomas, a retired teacher who had lived in the area for decades. "The Harrisons," he repeated, rubbing his chin. "That's a name I haven't heard in a long time." Emily nodded. "They lived in my house in the 50s. I'm trying to piece together why they left so suddenly." Thomas stood, walked to a filing cabinet, and returned with a thin folder labeled, Mayfield Residence, 1950 to 1960. He flipped through it slowly, stopping once he found Leonard Harrison's name. "Woodworker, right?" he said, pointing to a line in the record. "Worked part-time for a furniture company outside town. Margaret was known for growing herbs and flowers. Some folks bought from her. They kept to themselves. Do you know why they left?" Thomas hesitated. "No one really does. One day they were just gone. No notice. No estate sale. Their garden went untended for weeks. Then someone bought the place from the city, cheap. Rumors floated for a while." "What kind of rumors?" He shrugged. "Nothing solid. Some said Leonard got into trouble. Others thought they had debts. A few believed they hid something in the house, but that's typical small-town chatter. People love a mystery when there's nothing else to talk about." Emily nodded, unsure whether to share what she had found in the wall. She decided against it. As she left the Historical Society, a question nagged at her. If the Harrisons had left something behind, something important enough to hide, why wouldn't they come back for it? That evening, she pulled out the photograph from the tin box again. Leonard and Margaret stood side by side in front of the house. Margaret held something small and wrapped in her hands, almost reverently. The image was too blurry to make out details, but the way she cradled it reminded Emily of someone holding a keepsake, or a secret. On impulse, Emily showed the photo to Liam. "Do you recognize anything here?" she asked. He studied it for a moment, then shook his head. "Just looks like two people standing. The lady looks kind of sad." That night, as Emily prepared for bed, Sophie knocked on her bedroom door. "Mommy," she said quietly, "do you remember that hallway dream I had?" Emily paused. "The one where the lights blinked?" Sophie nodded. "Last night, I dreamed again. But this time, I saw someone walking in the hallway. A lady. She was holding something in her arms, but it wasn't a baby. It was wrapped up like a gift. And she whispered something." Emily crouched to eye level. "What did she say?" Sophie's brow furrowed, struggling to recall. "She said, 'Don't open it.'" Emily wrapped her arms around her daughter and held her tightly. "It was just a dream," she whispered. But even as she said it, she didn't believe it. The next morning, Emily went back into the hidden space, hoping for some overlooked clue. As she shifted one of the shelves, she noticed a gap near the rear corner. It wasn't deep, but there was something wedged between the boards, a small bundle wrapped in old cloth. She pulled it out slowly. It was heavier than expected. Inside was a collection of newspaper clippings, many too degraded to read, but a few still legible. The articles weren't about the Harrisons. They were about items missing from public spaces, objects stolen from the town museum, archived blueprints, and local property ledgers. None were high-profile crimes, but all were listed as unresolved. Tucked beneath the papers was one final note. They wanted it buried. "We tried. But it was never ours to keep." Emily stared at the handwriting. It matched the earlier note, the same rushed, looping script. She looked again at the diagram she had unrolled the night before. Symbols. Arrows. Instructions. This wasn't just a hidden space. It was a vault. A place deliberately built to store, not valuables, but records, artifacts, knowledge. Things someone had wanted out of sight. And yet, somehow, they were never retrieved. As the pieces assembled in her mind, Emily understood that the Harrisons had taken something they weren't supposed to have, information, objects, or perhaps both, and had hidden it in the one place no one would think to look, behind the walls of their own home. But whatever their reasons, they had left in silence. And now, after all this time, she had opened the door they never wanted touched. 2 days passed, each filled with more tension than the last. Emily found herself moving through the house with increasing awareness. Each creak in the floor, each flicker of shadow, each rustle from a vent was no longer just a part of the house's character, but a possible signal of something hidden, something watching. She tried not to show it, especially in front of the kids. But Liam had grown quieter, and Sophie had begun leaving her bedroom door open at night. Emily spent much of her time sorting through the artifacts she'd found, now laid out in careful rows across her bedroom dresser, her desk, and an old card table in the corner. She had catalogued everything: the photograph, the blueprint with the strange annotations, the cloth-wrapped bundle of newspaper clippings, and the 2 mysterious handwritten notes. But even as she tried to make sense of it all, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing, some connection, some explanation. On the morning of the 3rd day, a breeze slipped in through a cracked window and scattered several of the aged papers across the floor. Emily knelt to retrieve them and paused when she noticed something odd wedged beneath the dresser, a small, tightly folded piece of paper she didn't recognize. It hadn't been there the day before. She sat on the edge of the bed and unfolded it carefully. The ink had bled slightly with age, but the message was clear. To whoever finds this, we tried to seal it. We thought hiding it would protect everyone. But it always finds its way back. If you are reading this, leave the rest. Burn what you've uncovered. Do not seek more. There was no name. No date. Just a signature initial, M. Emily read it twice, then again. Her stomach tightened with each pass. She knew every object she had found. Every item was accounted for. This note had not been among them. Which meant someone, or something, had placed it there. She stood abruptly and checked the hallway. The compartment remained closed, exactly as she had left it. She searched the surrounding area again for signs of intrusion, forced entry, anything. There was nothing. Later that morning, Emily returned to the records she had copied at Town Hall and flipped again through the Harrison documents. One note referenced a post office box under the name M. Harrison, with no further context. A thought struck her: what if Margaret had written the warning? She drove to the local post office and waited in line behind an older couple discussing their dog's arthritis. When her turn came, she approached the counter and asked, cautiously, whether they had any records of long-closed boxes from the 1950s. The clerk looked skeptical but offered to check with the supervisor. After a short wait, she returned with a dusty binder and flipped it open on the counter. "We don't keep records that far back anymore, not formally," she explained, "but some of these ledgers list closures. Box numbers, mostly." Emily scanned the names, her finger running down the columns. There it was. Box number 89. Closed in October 1955. Name, M. Harrison. "Do you know where the contents went?" she asked. The clerk shrugged. If it was claimed, it would have been picked up before the box was deactivated. Otherwise, contents would have been sent to archives or discarded, depending on type. "Do you keep archives locally?" The clerk frowned. "No. Anything unclaimed that wasn't returned to sender would have been transferred to the county records office. But that office burned down in the 70s. Most paper files were lost." Emily thanked her and left, disappointment sitting heavy in her chest. But even without the contents of the box, the connection felt real. Margaret had tried to leave a message. Maybe more than one. The warning wasn't a threat, it was a plea. That night, unable to sleep, Emily returned once more to the photograph from the tin box. This time, she examined it under a magnifying glass she borrowed from Liam's toy kit. She focused on Margaret's hands, on the object she held. It wasn't a book. Nor a keepsake. It was rectangular, narrow, and bound in string. A letter bundle. And just behind Leonard, almost obscured by shadow, was something nailed to the porch beam. A strip of paper, curled at the corners. Emily flipped the photo over again. The inscription, "Keep safe. Not for others." The next morning, she went to the front porch and scanned the beams carefully, her fingers brushing over the old wood. Near the top of one column, she found the faint outline of a small nail hole and a strip of discoloration, as if something had been pinned there once and removed long ago. Back inside, she studied the newly discovered letter again. The handwriting was slightly different from the other notes, shakier. And yet it carried the same urgency. What had the Harrisons been trying to protect? Or suppress? By mid-afternoon, Emily received a knock at the door. Frank, the electrician, stood outside with a clipboard in one hand and a concerned look on his face. "I said I'd come back," he said. "Just making sure things didn't get worse." Emily hesitated, then motioned for him to come in. He walked through the hallway, slower this time, almost reverent in his steps. His gaze lingered on the wall where the compartment had been uncovered, then on the stack of papers Emily had left on the side table. "You found it, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Emily didn't pretend. "Yes." Frank set his clipboard down and leaned against the doorframe. "That space. I'd seen signs before. But I figured it was better left untouched." "Why?" He looked away for a moment. "My uncle lived across the street when I was a kid. He told stories. Said the family who lived here, before it sat empty, tried to keep something hidden. Something they weren't supposed to have. He said there were lights back then, too. Flickering. And noises. Things they couldn't explain." Emily crossed her arms. "Do you believe that?" Frank nodded, "Just once." "I do." She led him to the items she'd found and handed him the latest letter. He read it slowly, then exhaled hard through his nose. "You need to be careful," he said. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about hiding something physical. People like the Harrisons, they weren't criminals. They were scared. And fear that deep leaves marks. That night, Emily placed the letter in a sealed folder and locked it in a drawer. But just before going to bed, she returned to the hallway one last time. The light above her pulsed softly, once, twice. Then stopped. As she turned to leave, her eyes caught something at the base of the wall. A corner of paper, barely visible, pushed out from the molding. She bent down and pulled it free. It was another letter. This one was sealed. And addressed, in faded ink, to E. Carter. Her name. Emily Carter. She hadn't told anyone her full name since moving here. Her blood ran cold as she turned the envelope over in her hands, too afraid to open it, too shaken to let it go. It had been waiting. And now, it had found her. Emily pressed the envelope to her chest for a moment before gently placing it on the kitchen table. She knew she should call Frank, or even the police, but she also understood that any official investigation might mean drawing attention to whatever the Harrisons hid. She wasn't sure yet whether that attention would help or harm. She took a deep breath. It was almost dusk when she decided to walk the neighborhood, giving herself time to think while moving. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of autumn leaves. The tall pines whispered overhead as she made her way down Pine Crescent, glancing at houses that looked like relics of another time. Most of the neighbors had their lights on, warm glows behind curtained windows. A few were silent, shut up for the evening. She stopped at Mr. Jacobs's house. He had lived here long enough to know nearly everyone, and Emily hoped he might recall something more about the Harrisons, or even the envelope addressed to her. She stepped up the short walkway and knocked. The door opened before she could finish her knock. Mr. Jacobs looked older than she remembered, stooped slightly, his face more lined, but his eyes still had sharpness in them. He peered at her warily. "Emily," he said, hesitating. "Good evening. To what do I owe the visit?" She forced a small smile. "Mr. Jacobs, I wanted to ask you something about the house I moved into, 46 Pine Crescent. The previous owners, the Harrisons, do you remember them?" His face tightened. He leaned against the doorframe, as if bracing himself. "I remember them well," he said softly. "Quiet folks. Kept to themselves. Did you ever hear anything odd when they lived here? Knocks, noises, flickers of light?" she asked, careful not to reveal too much. He hesitated. "You might call it odd. I remember the evening lights sometimes flickered in that house, especially the back hall. I thought it was just wiring. But after they left, I heard stories from neighbors, strange things in that home nobody wanted to talk about. Stories? Mr. Jacobs closed the door and beckoned her inside. The house smelled faintly of old books and wood polish. He led her to a small living room, where a single lamp glowed. She sat on the edge of a floral armchair, he sat across from her in another. They said Leonard Harrison was working on something in that house nobody else was meant to see, Mr. Jacobs said, his voice low. Some neighbors thought he had secret rooms, hidden compartments. Others believed he was safeguarding items, papers, documents, maybe something more valuable. But no one ever saw anything. He left quietly, with minimal trace. Emily nodded. I found a hidden compartment in my wall, and items inside, letters, papers, diagrams. And now I have a sealed letter addressed to me. I don't know who put it there. Jacobs glanced toward the hallway from inside the house. I heard something tonight. From your house. Maybe a soft knocking or shifting. Could be the wind, could be not. These old walls creak when secrets move. She felt a chill she couldn't easily dismiss. Do you mind if I ask, do you know of anyone in town now, or back then, who might have had contact with the Harrisons, or had reason to retrieve something they hid? He sat back in the chair, rubbed his chin. There was one fellow, a man named Watts, I think, local historian, tinkerer, curious sort. Always poking around where he didn't belong. He asked questions about old properties, maps, blueprints. Some folks thought he was nosy. Others said he was harmless, just someone who liked puzzles. Do you know where he is now? Jacobs frowned. Last I heard, he moved away years ago. Maybe to the city. But I recall he kept copies of town blueprints and old maps. Maybe he had records Harrison's destroyed or hid. Emily's mind spun with possibilities. She thanked Mr. Jacobs and stood. He walked her to the door. Be careful, he said as she stepped outside. Secrets have a way of stretching across time. Just because something is hidden doesn't mean it's safe to reveal. That night, Emily placed the envelope addressed to her on the dining table and rejected the idea of opening it until morning. The shadows in the hallway seemed thicker, the house quieter, ominous even. She lay awake for hours, the sealed envelope a weight on her mind. Eventually, sleep claimed her. At dawn's first light, she tiptoed from her room and made her way to the kitchen. Carefully she picked up the envelope, studied the faded ink of her name. Her heart hammered. She slid a thin letter opener, one she used for opening utility bills, under the flap and eased it open. Inside was a single sheet, folded once, edges frayed. Unfolding it, her eyes read. Emily Carter. You have taken what we long left hidden. That which was buried deep is stirring again. Some things are not forgotten, even when they sleep. Be cautious of those who ask. And trust no shadow. M. Her breath caught. She had expected something frantic, maybe a demand, but this was a warning. Cryptic, and insistent. She ran her finger along the signature, M. Margaret? Or someone else using the initial? She felt the hair on her arm stand. Who was watching her? Who had left that letter? Later that morning, she called Frank. She told him she needed to see him right away. She needed help securing the hidden space and examining the items she had uncovered. He agreed to come by in the afternoon. As she waited, Emily reviewed all the documents and objects again. Everything lined up, hidden compartments, letters, diagrams, warnings. Someone had been trying to keep a secret. Someone had tried to warn others away. And now, she was in the middle of it. When Frank arrived, she led him to the hallway. He looked at the wall, then at the open compartment. She handed him the envelope and the letter. Frank's expression was grave. He ran a hand through his hair. We need to secure this, he said. Make sure it can't be tampered with again. And we need to look through everything carefully, see if there's any clue to who M is. Or who might retrieve these things now. They spent the afternoon reinforcing the edges of the compartment, adding a hidden latch behind the shelves and framing it to match surrounding wood. While doing so, Frank noticed small notches on the inside frame, marks, as though tools had been used there more than once, long ago. He marked this so only someone knowing the pattern could open it, he said. Emily nodded. A safe door in miniature. Frank glanced at her. Be careful with that letter. Whoever wrote it may still be around. That night, Emily slept with one eye open. The house seemed alive, the walls seemed to breathe. And when she drifted off, a dream came, the hallway, dim light, a woman holding something wrapped in brown paper, turning away, whispering, "Do not let it go." Then silence. In the morning, Emily awoke with the scent of old paper in her nostrils and a sudden urgency in her chest. Whatever the Harrisons had hidden had found its way back into her life. She didn't know who M was, or who might be coming to claim the secret. But now, she was determined to face it. The days grew shorter. Light drained from the sky faster now, casting long shadows across the house before dinner. Emily noticed the temperature in the back hallway had dropped, not sharply, but enough to make her pause each time she walked past. She kept the compartment sealed and the letter locked in her bedroom drawer, but something had shifted. The quiet tension in the house was no longer just hers. Liam had begun closing his door at night. Sophie, once fearless, now refused to go anywhere near the hallway without holding her mother's hand. Frank returned the next morning to help her conduct a thorough inspection of the basement. He carried a floodlight and a compact digital scanner, something he normally used to locate old electrical conduits. Emily appreciated the quiet professionalism with which he moved through the space. No unnecessary commentary. No dramatics. He was trying to help, even if the situation was veering further away from simple circuitry. The basement was unfinished, with a low ceiling and exposed beams. The smell of earth was stronger here. Frank began scanning the walls along the foundation while Emily studied the blueprints again. The diagram she had discovered weeks before didn't perfectly align with the current floor plan. There were subtle differences, angles slightly off, measurements that didn't match exactly. It was almost as if the house had been modified after the blueprints had been drawn, but done so subtly that no permits had been filed. This wall here, Frank said, tapping the western basement wall with the butt of his flashlight. It's thicker than the others. About 8 inches more, if this scanner's right. That's not structural, it's added. Like a false wall? Emily asked. Or a hidden corridor, Frank replied, his tone neutral. Emily stepped closer and examined the area. The plaster was old, cracked in spots, but there were no obvious seams. She pressed her palm against it, feeling for vibration, anything unusual. The surface was cold. Too cold. Do you think it connects to the compartment upstairs? Could, Frank said. Or it could be a storage space that was sealed when they redid the wiring. If they had something they didn't want others to find, this would have been the place to keep it. They worked carefully for over 2 hours, eventually removing a small section of paneling near the base. Behind it was a gap, just wide enough to reach inside. Emily held the floodlight as Frank probed the space with a metal rod, feeling around. Then he stopped. There's something flat back here, he said. Feels like a frame? He reached in with both hands and pulled carefully. A wooden board, maybe 2 feet tall, slid into view, wrapped in cloth and sealed with a waxy substance along the edges. Frank set it on the floor gently. Emily crouched. The cloth was dark blue, worn but intact. She peeled it back slowly to reveal a frame, and within it, a panel of paper or parchment, mounted behind glass. Symbols had been drawn across it in what looked like charcoal or black ink, shapes, arrows, and lines similar to those on the hidden diagram upstairs. But this one was far more detailed. The text along the border wasn't English. Some of it looked like Latin, but the phrasing was distorted, abbreviated, fragmented. At the bottom, there was a single English phrase written in faded pen. To be viewed by no one. Do not unseal. Emily stared at it. This doesn't make sense. Why go through the trouble to frame something and then bury it behind a false wall? Frank didn't respond. He stared at the parchment with narrowed eyes. because someone thought even looking at it might be dangerous. She wanted to laugh at the idea, dangerous drawings, but the weight of the room, the dense silence, made her hold back. Something about the artifact made her skin tighten. She took photos, carefully, then wrapped it back in the cloth and set it aside. As they prepared to explore further along the basement wall, a faint noise echoed above them. Not footsteps, not quite. A shifting weight. A low creak. Emily froze. That was upstairs. Frank clicked off the floodlight. They stood in silence, listening. Another sound, a faint shuffling, as though someone moved across the hallway above. Then stillness. I locked the front door, she whispered. No one should be here. Frank moved first. He grabbed a heavy wrench from his toolkit and motioned for Emily to follow. They climbed the stairs cautiously, avoiding the creaking steps. Emily reached for the doorknob leading into the main floor, then slowly opened it. The hallway was empty. But the envelope, the one she had locked in her bedroom drawer, now sat on the hallway floor, the flap slightly open. She picked it up with trembling hands. The letter was gone. Only the envelope remained. Frank took a step back, his jaw tense. How long has that drawer been locked? Since the night I found the letter. He said nothing. That evening, Emily placed all recovered items inside a locked box, which she stored in a cabinet in her bedroom closet. She left a camera recording the hallway, and another in the basement. It wasn't paranoia anymore. She needed evidence. She needed answers. Later, she visited Mr. Jacobs again. She brought the photograph, the diagram, and one of the notes. When he saw the drawing, he stiffened. I've seen that, he said. Years ago. A friend of mine used to work for the town archives before they burned. He once showed me something similar, said it was from a house out near Crescent Ridge, but it had no owner name. Just coded references and symbols. He said some documents were flagged not for destruction, but for isolation. For what reason? Jacobs shook his head. He didn't say. Only that the documents were never supposed to circulate. And then, he left. Moved to Idaho, I think. Disappeared after that. Emily absorbed the information, her mind swimming. She thanked him again and returned home. That night, she sat with the box in her lap, staring at the contents. What if none of this had been meant to be solved? What if it wasn't a puzzle, but a warning? What if the Harrisons had hidden the truth not out of guilt, but out of duty? The basement wall had more to offer. She knew it. Somewhere behind the drawings and symbols, a deeper truth was buried. And she intended to find it. Emily sat at the kitchen table with the box in front of her, its contents neatly arranged in rows she had memorized. Each item had been catalogued, documented, and even rewrapped to preserve what little remained of their original condition. But no matter how many times she laid them out or how many ways she tried to interpret the drawings and letters, something continued to elude her, a missing thread that refused to unravel. She stared again at the framed parchment retrieved from the basement wall, now rewrapped in the blue cloth and locked in the same box. The phrase at the bottom, "To be viewed by no one. Do not unseal," kept echoing in her head. The longer she thought about it, the more she began to believe that these weren't just warnings, they were instructions. Instructions for someone like her. Someone who was never meant to find any of this. Frank hadn't returned in 2 days. He had left a message saying he needed to check on a project out of town and that he would call when he could. Emily didn't press. She sensed that something about their last discovery in the basement had unsettled him. Maybe more than he had admitted. Sophie was quieter than usual. She spent her time drawing, sometimes using black crayon and heavy lines, which was unlike her. Liam was observant enough to pick up on the unease in the house. He had taken to keeping his flashlight on even during the day. On Thursday morning, Emily received a call from the local library. She had submitted a request days ago for any archived letters or references to the Harrison family in local correspondences. The librarian, a soft-spoken woman named Carla, had found something. Emily arrived less than an hour later. "It's not much," Carla said as she handed her a sealed envelope with a photocopied note inside. "But this letter was found among donated documents from the town council back in the 70s. It mentions the house, the Harrisons, and something they called the Corridor Project." Emily unfolded the page and read. "We advised Leonard to abandon the Corridor Project. The storage method he's using is unconventional and, frankly, dangerous. If it fails, it may bring attention to everything we agreed to bury. He assured me no one outside the family knew of it, especially not the children. I warned him again. If they find it, if the town suspects, we will all be exposed." There was no signature. No address. Just those words on a single yellowed sheet of paper. Emily thanked Carla and drove home in silence, the phrase, "the Corridor Project," running in loops through her mind. It had to refer to the wall. The hidden space. But the tone of the letter hinted at something more than just hidden objects. It was about secrecy on a wider scale. There was fear in the words, urgency. She returned to the house and pulled the diagram from the hidden compartment again. The more she looked, the more she noticed the logic of the markings. Arrows followed routes not along visible rooms but around them. The blueprint didn't just map the physical space of the house. It mapped absences, sections that didn't belong to any part of the public floor plan. She spread the diagram beside the new letter and began cross-referencing it with the property dimensions she had pulled from the town's archives. Sure enough, there was a 12-foot span between the inner basement wall and the exterior foundation that wasn't accounted for. It had been dismissed previously as part of the crawlspace, but now she realized it was more than that. She returned to the basement, flashlight in hand, and began tapping methodically along the far wall. After 20 minutes, her knuckles hit something different, not hollow, but reverberant, like a metal panel beneath the plaster. She examined the surface again and spotted something she hadn't seen before, a tiny metal hinge, almost entirely camouflaged beneath layers of old paint. Using a screwdriver, she pried the panel open. Inside was a small iron box, no larger than a shoebox, wedged between support beams. It had no lock, just a pressure seal. She lifted it gently and carried it upstairs. The box was heavy. She opened it carefully. Inside, there were more documents, several sealed envelopes, each labeled only by date. The oldest was from 1949, the newest from 1955. Beneath them, a small leather-bound book rested against the bottom. Its cover was cracked, but the spine was intact. She opened it to the first page. It was a journal. If something happens to us, this record must be preserved. What we found was never meant to be known, but we couldn't destroy it. Margaret wanted to. I refused. That may have been my greatest mistake. The entries were scattered and fragmented, but one thread was clear: Leonard had discovered something old, something buried by the town or possibly by others before them. He had not fully understood it, but he believed it mattered enough to hide. He referenced symbols, documents, and even a visitor from a historical society who asked too many questions. Margaret had wanted it gone. She had feared what might come if others found it. But Leonard had built the compartments. He had sealed the diagram. He had planned the corridor. And he had failed. Emily read through every page, heart racing, hands trembling. Names were mentioned, most unfamiliar. A few matched names she had seen in the archive indexes. There was a reference to a town council member, to a historian named F. Watts, and to a list Leonard had compiled of people who had seen the diagram and understood its implications. He had burned the list, he said, out of fear. At the end of the journal, one final entry stood alone. Margaret says it must sleep. But the house doesn't forget. If you read this, do not look for the rest. There is no safety in knowing. Emily closed the journal and sat in silence. She had uncovered everything the Harrisons had left behind, maps, notes, warnings, but she was no closer to understanding what the original threat had been. Only that they had feared discovery more than anything else. She looked again at the journal's last sentence and realized something chilling. the Harrisons had not feared exposure because of legal repercussions or scandal. They had feared it because they believed knowing, truly knowing, what lay behind their discoveries was in itself dangerous. The next day, Emily received a package on her porch. No return address. Inside was a photograph of her house, taken from the street. Not recent, old. The edges were curled, and the colors faded. In the photo, a figure stood by the porch railing. A woman. Too distant to identify. Scrawled on the back in faded black ink. It always begins with the wall. The morning sun filtered weakly through the windows, casting fractured light across the kitchen table, where Emily sat staring at the photograph that had arrived the day before. The image of the woman on the porch, unmistakably from another era, gnawed at her. She felt sure now that someone was watching. Not only had they accessed her home, but they had knowledge of the Harrisons' history deeper than anything in public records. And now, they had made their presence known. Whoever sent the package had done so with intention. It wasn't a warning. It was a message: you've gone too far. But Emily was beyond the point of retreat. After sending Liam and Sophie to spend the afternoon with the neighbors, under the pretense of Mom needing quiet to finish writing, Emily called Frank. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook as she explained the latest developments. He listened in silence, then finally said he'd meet her at the house later that evening. He didn't ask questions. He didn't express doubt. His only response before hanging up was, "Lock everything until I get there." In the meantime, Emily reviewed the leather journal again, this time with fresh eyes. She hadn't noticed the inconsistencies in Leonard's writing before, moments when the handwriting changed, becoming sharper, more rigid, as if someone else had taken over or as if his mental state had shifted. One entry in particular struck her as odd. There was someone else. Not Margaret. Not me. A third voice. It spoke through the wall once. Said things I never wrote. I woke to see ink drying where I'd left none. She read it 3 times, trying to dismiss it as paranoia, as the ramblings of a man in isolation. But the pattern was undeniable. This was more than fear. Leonard had begun to unravel, slowly but distinctly, the deeper he went into the secrets he'd sealed within the house. By late afternoon, the shadows in the hallway lengthened early. Emily set up a small chair beside the compartment and sat with the framed diagram in her lap. She no longer studied it for answers. She simply stared at it, hoping it would speak to her in a way Leonard claimed it had to him. A soft knock at the door pulled her out of the trance. It wasn't Frank. Standing on the porch was a woman Emily had never seen before. She wore a pale beige coat, hair pulled into a low bun, and her expression was calm but fixed. "Emily Carter?" she asked. Emily hesitated, hand still on the doorknob. "Yes? I'm Nora Brandt. I work with the historical registry in the county. May I come in?" Emily studied her face for a beat. The woman's ID badge, clipped to the edge of her coat, looked legitimate, but something about her manner was rehearsed. Still, Emily stepped aside. "I assume you're here about the Harrison property," Emily said as Nora entered the foyer. "Partly," Nora replied. "We've been reviewing long-dormant files and flagged this house during a recent archive merge. Your activity triggered a review." She smiled lightly. "Nothing serious. Just procedural." "Procedural enough to show up without a call?" Nora's smile didn't waver. "I thought it best to be direct." Emily gestured toward the living room. They sat opposite each other, the silence taut. Nora folded her hands. "I'm going to be honest with you, Miss Carter. The Harrisons were not ordinary citizens. They were part of a private group, something between a preservation society and an independent archive. Their purpose was to protect knowledge deemed volatile. Not necessarily dangerous, but not public. Think of it like early damage control." Emily kept her expression neutral. "You're saying they were archivists?" "In a sense, yes. But they weren't protecting items of value in the usual way. They believed some historical records, if misinterpreted or studied without context, could cause more harm than good. The corridor, the diagrams, even the sealed compartments, those were all part of a system. A private system of containment. Emily leaned forward. So you knew about this? I know about some of it, Nora replied. Most of it was dismantled after the group dissolved. But your discovery of the diagram and the journal reopened something that should have remained buried. That's why I'm here. Emily's voice dropped. To take it away? To make sure you understand what it means. You're too late for that, Emily said. I've seen everything. No, Nora replied softly. You've seen fragments. Enough to attract attention, but not enough to interpret it correctly. That's the danger. Emily reached into the cabinet beside her and retrieved the sealed box. Then tell me what I'm looking at. Nora took a moment. She opened the box, gently lifted the diagram, and stared at it for a long time. This, she said, isn't just a map. It's a safeguard. It marks not what was hidden, but what was never supposed to be found. The Harrisons weren't just hiding knowledge. They were hiding access. And you've opened the way. Emily's chest tightened. Access to what? Nora shook her head. No one knows anymore. That's why the group disbanded. Too many disagreements. Some believed the diagrams were nonsense. Others believed they pointed to an old structure, older than Mayfield itself. Something buried long before the town was built. So this house was chosen, Nora finished. Intentionally. It was built over a point the diagrams refer to as the origin. Leonard Harrison discovered this after the construction. He tried to wall it off, but by then, something had already stirred. Emily felt her throat tighten. The voices. The symbols. The light flickers. Nora nodded. Residuals. Energy, perhaps. Or something else. But now that you've uncovered the compartments, the signal is out again. And others, like me, have been watching for it. Are you here alone? Emily asked. For the first time, Nora's expression darkened. Yes. But not for long. If others find out what you found, it won't be just historians and archivists who come. A car pulled into the driveway. Frank. Nora stood. Whatever's in that basement, don't go further. Don't dig. Let it settle again. Before Emily could respond, Nora opened the door and walked past Frank without another word. He stepped aside, watching her leave, then turned back to Emily. Friend of yours? Emily exhaled. Not exactly. Together, they returned to the living room. Frank looked at the open box. You were going to tell me about that today, weren't you? Yes, she replied. But now I think we're out of time. He looked at her, serious. Then let's finish what they started. Frank stood in the basement doorway, his silhouette outlined by the dim light from the stairwell above. Emily followed him down slowly, gripping the railing tighter than usual, each creak of the wood beneath her feet sounding louder than it should. The air had changed. It was colder, heavier. Even Frank, who rarely voiced unease, kept glancing back toward her, as if to make sure she was still behind him. They reached the far end of the basement and paused before the wall where they had discovered the iron box days earlier. The panel was still open, the void behind it black and silent. Emily knelt and ran her hand along the edge of the floor. Her fingers found the faint outline of a seam, one she hadn't noticed before. Not in the blueprint. Not in the journal. It was a gap just wide enough to suggest the presence of a panel beneath the concrete slab. She looked at Frank. There's something underneath. He nodded. We'll need tools. Let's not rush it. Over the next half hour, they cleared the floor. Frank used a crowbar to lift the edge of the wooden frame that bordered the seam. A section of the basement flooring creaked upward with minimal resistance. Underneath, a dark, dusty hatch was revealed, old iron, rimmed with corroded bolts, and stamped with a symbol Emily recognized instantly. It was from the diagram. A circle split into 3 arcs, with a dot at the center. Same as the blueprint, she said quietly. Frank tested the hatch with the edge of his boot. It didn't budge. We're going to need leverage. After bringing down a car jack and a steel rod, they worked together, alternating pressure until the iron hatch began to groan. Dust fell from the ceiling as the floor protested the shift. At last, with one final wrench, the hatch cracked open. A rush of air escaped, stale and dry. Frank shone a flashlight down into the space below. A wooden ladder descended into darkness. The walls were made of stone, not concrete, not brick, but old masonry, hand-laid and aged. Was this on any of the property maps? Frank asked. No, Emily replied. This is older than the house. They descended slowly, step by step, the ladder creaking beneath their weight. The air grew colder the deeper they went, until the passage opened into a narrow corridor just over 6 feet high. The stone walls were close, almost claustrophobically so. A single metal track lined the ceiling, as if it once held a wire or rail system. Emily ran her fingers along the wall. This wasn't meant for public use. It's too hidden. Frank scanned the passage with his light. The corridor stretched forward for perhaps 30 feet, then took a sharp turn to the right. Dust blanketed everything, but there were no signs of rodents, no cobwebs, no decay. It was as if the air down here refused to move, like time itself had stopped. They turned the corner, and ahead of them, embedded into the far wall, was a metal door. It had no handle. No hinges. Only another symbol, the same as the one on the hatch, burned into its center. A narrow slot had been carved beneath the symbol, just wide enough to insert a document or object. Emily looked at Frank. This was sealed on purpose. And not just to keep people out. To keep something in. He nodded. And whatever it is, it hasn't been touched in decades. They circled the room, inspecting the stone. Along the walls were faint markings, lines etched directly into the stone, matching the orientation of the diagram. Frank held up the parchment to compare. They matched exactly. Emily pulled the leather journal from her bag, flipping back to the final entries. One line stood out now more than ever. Margaret refused to go further. She said the passage turned inward. That there was no light there, only reflection. I heard my voice before I spoke. Frank didn't speak for a long time. Then, slowly, he said, this is no longer just about hidden records. This is about containment. Psychological or otherwise. Emily looked at the narrow slot beneath the symbol. What if the sealed letters, those in the iron box, weren't just warnings, she said. What if they were keys? They returned upstairs, retrieved one of the sealed envelopes from the box, the one marked June 1952, and brought it back down. Emily slid it slowly into the slot. It fit snugly, then clicked as if caught by some unseen mechanism. The metal door didn't open. But something shifted. Behind the stone wall, a groan vibrated through the corridor, like metal sliding along rails, somewhere deep within. The air trembled. The light from Frank's flashlight flickered, then steadied. Then silence. The door remained shut. Emily pressed her hand against it. Still cold. Still unmoving. That wasn't mechanical, Frank said. That was structural. Something realigned. They stood in silence, unsure of whether to feel relief or dread. Back upstairs, Emily replayed the sound over and over in her mind. Not a mechanism unlocking, but a chamber adjusting. Repositioning. She sat with the journal in her lap, rereading Leonard's entries. She saw what he had tried to do, not just hide knowledge but bind it to a system that required specific sequences. A safeguard that used time, location, and intention to limit access. The next morning, she received a letter in the mail. No postage, no name. Inside was a single typed sentence. You passed the first gate. Do not pass the second. No signature. Just like the last time. Emily looked toward the hallway, then toward the basement door. The narrow passage was no longer just a discovery. It was part of a sequence, designed, deliberate, and deeply intentional. And someone else knew she had activated it. For the rest of the day, Emily kept the letter folded in her pocket. She didn't tell Frank about it, not yet. She needed time to think, to understand what it truly meant. The message was brief, impersonal, but direct: you passed the first gate. Do not pass the second. It wasn't just a warning. It was an acknowledgement. Someone, somewhere, knew exactly what she and Frank had done the night before in the passage. That someone had eyes on them. She spent the morning reviewing the remaining sealed envelopes they had yet to insert into the corridor slot. Each one, dated between 1950 and 1955, had the same weight, the same paper texture, the same waxy seal. She noticed that the seals themselves carried the same symbol etched into the metal hatch and the corridor door. A triangle enclosed in a circle, with a line running through the center, a variation of the earlier diagram. This symbol hadn't appeared on anything from the town archives, nor in any document she found at the Historical Society. Which meant it hadn't been part of the town's official history. It had been part of something older. Something private. By afternoon, Emily walked to the neighbor's house to collect Sophie and Liam. They were sitting on the porch, drawing pictures of the house from memory. Sophie handed Emily her drawing without a word. It showed their house, the porch, the large trees out front. But in the top window, above the hallway, was a small figure standing behind the glass. "There's someone in my room," Sophie said softly. Emily looked up at the house, then back at the paper. The windows Sophie had drawn didn't match her room, it matched the spare room across the hallway. The one they didn't use. The one that overlooked the backyard and had always stayed unnaturally cold. That evening, Emily asked Frank to stay late. They secured the compartment, double-locked the basement hatch, and sealed the iron box with additional clasps. Then, they sat down in the living room, the silence between them thick. "I got another letter," Emily said finally. Frank turned to her, his expression tightening. "Same sender?" She nodded and passed him the folded message. He read it twice. "It confirms what I suspected," he said. "There's a sequence. The corridor isn't just a hiding place. It's a system. Like a vault with multiple steps. Gates," she said. He looked at her. "And you've triggered one." Emily leaned forward. What if the reason the Harrisons left wasn't fear of exposure? What if it was because they failed to control what the house was designed to suppress? Frank exhaled slowly. Then that means this house wasn't just chosen for its location. It was designed for its function. He stood and retrieved the blueprint from the hallway drawer. "Look at this, here. These walls." He traced the lines. "This is more than structure. It's a barrier." "Against what?" He hesitated. "I don't know. But I think it's waking up." The lights flickered once. Then twice. A long, low hum seemed to rise from the floorboards beneath them. Emily stood. "Do you feel that?" Frank nodded. "It's like a vibration." They followed the sensation to the hallway. The light above the sealed compartment glowed steady now, no longer flickering. But it was brighter than before. Almost as if something beneath it was drawing energy. Frank knelt and pressed his ear to the floor. "It's not mechanical," he said. "It's rhythmic." Emily reached for the journal again, flipping to a page she hadn't fully understood before. If the house begins to respond, it means the sequence has started. Only one can finish it. The others must stay clear, or it will fracture. The house only listens to one voice at a time. She sat back against the wall, her mind racing. The house wasn't haunted. It wasn't cursed. It was responding, reacting. Not to noise, or movement, or even discovery. To intent. Everything pointed back to her. Not Frank. Not the Harrisons anymore. Her. The next morning, she went back to the Historical Society. Carla, the librarian, greeted her with a curious look. "Strange timing," Carla said. "Someone else was asking about your house this morning. A man. Said he was a relative of the Harrisons." Emily's stomach dropped. "Did he leave a name?" "No. Said he'd be back." Emily returned home immediately. The moment she stepped inside, she knew someone had entered the house in her absence. Nothing was broken. Nothing was missing. But the iron box was unlocked. Inside, the sealed envelope dated January 1955 was gone. She locked the compartment and called Frank. "Someone has the final key," she said. "And I think they mean to use it." That night, she sat alone in the hallway, waiting. She placed the remaining letters in her lap and stared at the wall opposite the compartment. The temperature in the hallway dropped steadily. A soft ticking began in the pipes, but it wasn't plumbing. It was measured. Deliberate. Footsteps moved above her head. Then stopped. She stood and climbed the stairs, moving toward the spare room. The door was ajar. Inside, the air was colder than anywhere else in the house. The windows were shut. The bed untouched. But on the floor, placed gently beneath the window, was the missing envelope. It had been opened. And inside it was not a letter. It was a photograph of Emily. Standing in the basement. Facing the corridor door. The picture had been taken from behind. And she had been alone. Emily stared at the photograph for a long time, her breath shallow, her hands cold. The image was unmistakably her posture, her sweater, the slight tilt of her head as she had stood in the basement 2 nights earlier. But the most disturbing part wasn't the perspective from which the photo was taken. It was the fact that her shadow in the image didn't align with the position of the light in the room. It stretched in the opposite direction, unnaturally long, pointing toward the corridor door rather than away from it. She folded the photograph and slipped it into her jacket pocket. There was no longer any doubt. Someone had been inside the house. Someone had opened the envelope, watched her, and left behind evidence of their presence, not as a threat, but as a prompt. As if they were telling her, "You're not done." Downstairs, the lights dimmed briefly. Then silence. Not the ordinary silence of an empty room, but the heavy, expectant quiet that settles before something significant begins. Emily picked up the remaining letters and the blueprint, grabbed a flashlight, and moved toward the basement door. Frank was out of reach. She had called him 3 times with no answer. Her neighbors were asleep. Liam and Sophie were at her sister's for the weekend. The house belonged only to her now. She descended the stairs slowly, each footstep echoing louder than the last. The hatch leading to the narrow passage was still shut, the bolts recently reinforced, but not enough to feel entirely secure. Emily knelt and began to undo the latches. As she lifted the hatch, the cold air from below greeted her like an old memory. The same ladder, the same silence, the same pull, subtle and invisible, drawing her downward. She climbed in. The narrow corridor was darker now than it had been days earlier. Her flashlight flickered but held. She turned the corner and once again faced the door. The diagram still matched every etching on the walls. The strange markings pulsed faintly beneath the dust, almost like they had absorbed light over time and were now slowly releasing it. Emily took the final sealed envelope and approached the slot beneath the symbol. The envelope felt warmer than the others had, as though it had been carried close to the body of whoever left it in the upstairs room. She slid it in. There was no click. No vibration. No response. But as she stepped back, the door itself groaned. The edges began to pull inward, not open, not slide, but fold, compressing into the stone as though the material were collapsing in on itself. Beyond the threshold was a chamber. Smaller than she expected. Circular. No larger than 10 feet across. The walls were smooth, unlike the stone corridor, and bore no markings. In the center stood a pedestal, no taller than her waist. Resting on it was a wooden box, square, sealed with an iron clasp shaped like the same symbol she had seen a dozen times. The box pulsed faintly, not with light, but with presence. As if it were waiting for something. Emily stepped forward. Her voice, though barely above a whisper, filled the space. "This is what you left behind." She reached out, placed her hands on the box, and paused. Every warning, every letter, every drawing, all of them led to this. The corridor was never a trap. It was a final station. The Harrisons hadn't just buried knowledge. They had built a test. She opened the box. Inside, there was no relic, no book, no hidden artifact. Just a thin layer of cloth folded over something flat. She pulled it back. It was a mirror. Rectangular, its edges scorched, the glass darkened like smoke had once filled it. But as she looked into it, she didn't see her reflection. She saw the hallway. Her hallway. She saw herself standing in it, but her expression was blank, her eyes unfocused. Then the figure in the mirror blinked. Not in sync with her. She staggered back, dropping the mirror into the box, slamming the lid closed. The pedestal groaned. The door behind her shuddered, then began to seal shut. Emily sprinted through the corridor, climbing the ladder just as the hatch beneath her rattled. She shut it, bolting it down. The house returned to silence. For hours, she sat at the kitchen table in the dark, her mind numb. The mirror had shown her something she couldn't understand. Not her reflection, not a vision, but a parallel. A doubling. A second version of herself trapped in the house she lived in, perhaps always had been. The next day, Frank returned. He looked pale, shaken. "I was followed," he said. Emily nodded. "I think we both are now." They reviewed everything once more. Diagrams, journal entries, letters. The common thread wasn't fear. It was containment. "You think it's conscious?" Frank asked. "I think it's reactive," she replied. "It doesn't want to harm anyone. But it was designed to respond. To mimic. To mirror. Then what happens now? We leave it sealed." She handed him the box containing the final notes and the photograph from the spare room. "You keep these. If anything happens to me, you show someone. But not until then." He nodded. Weeks passed. The lights in the hallway no longer flickered. The temperature returned to normal. The children began to laugh again. But sometimes, late at night, when the house was still and the air held its breath, Emily would stand at the edge of the hallway and feel that pull again. Not fear. Not dread. Recognition. And she would whisper to no one in particular, "I see you too."